When the first snow fell, it came as a warning. Eli Lapp had always trusted the land to guide him, but this winter, the land might not be enough. As the chill set in, the quiet of the valley held a deeper kind of silence, one that felt like a prelude to a storm far worse than the one in the sky. And it would be a test not just of survival, but of faith. Before we begin, share where you're watching from, and if stories of faith and simple living touch your heart, join us for tomorrow's tale. The morning had broken with a heavy frost, the air so still it seemed as though the earth itself was holding its breath. Eli Lapp pulled his coat tighter around him as he stepped onto the porch, the dark green fields stretching before him, now blanketed in white. Winter had come early this year, but this felt different. Even for the cold of Lancaster County, this early frost carried an edge of finality, like a promise of a harsher season to come. Inside, the stove crackled with warmth, the firelight casting soft shadows on the walls. Anna, Eli's wife, stood by the stove, stirring a pot of soup, her hands steady and sure. She had always been the calm to his storm, her presence an anchor when the world outside threatened to overwhelm. But today, she seemed lost in thought, her brow furrowed as she ladled broth into bowls. Eli watched her for a moment before stepping into the kitchen. "You feeling all right?" he asked, his voice low, barely above the sound of the fire. Anna didn't answer right away. She set down the spoon and turned to him, her hands resting on the edge of the table. "I don't know," she said finally, her voice soft but laced with concern. "I've been thinking about the winter ahead. It's going to be harder than we've faced in years, Eli. The neighbors say the storm is coming. It feels like there's no escaping it." Eli sighed and placed a hand on her shoulder, offering what comfort he could, though his heart echoed her uncertainty. He had seen the clouds gathering in the distance, felt the subtle changes in the air. The old-timers always said that the land would tell you what it needed, and Eli had always trusted it. But there was something in the silence this time, something he couldn't name, but couldn't ignore. "We'll get through," he said, though the words felt like a promise he wasn't sure he could keep. The cabin had been built strong, and they had worked the land well, but no one could predict what this winter would bring. The wind howled outside, as if in agreement. Anna turned her attention back to the soup, the familiar motions of stirring offering a moment of peace in the midst of their quiet unease. The door opened just then, and Eli's son Samuel stepped inside, his cheeks red from the cold. "Father, the barn is ready for the animals, but we should bring in the last of the firewood before the snow gets any deeper." Eli nodded, his thoughts already turning to the work ahead. They had to be prepared. The storm was coming, and they needed to gather every resource, every scrap of warmth and food they could. By the time dusk settled over the valley, the first snow had begun to fall in earnest. It came slowly at first, the tiny flakes dancing in the evening air before settling on the ground. But within hours, the storm had strengthened. The snow fell in heavy sheets, covering the earth like a thick, white blanket, muting the world outside. The once crisp air had turned cold and biting, and the fire in the hearth struggled to keep up with the chill creeping through the cracks in the walls. Inside, the family gathered close. The warmth from the stove offered only fleeting comfort, and the wind howled against the walls as though trying to break through. Anna had lit the lanterns, their soft glow pushing back the dark, but it felt like the storm had already crept into their bones, its cold reaching them no matter how much they tried to shield themselves. Eli sat in his usual chair near the fire, his eyes fixed on the flickering flames. His mind wasn't on the warmth, it was on the land outside, where the storm was taking hold. The barn was stocked with hay and grain for the livestock, and the food pantry was filled with canned goods, jars of preserves, and root vegetables from the harvest. But there was something else, the unknown, that lingered at the edges of his thoughts. It wasn't just about surviving the winter. It was about something deeper, something harder to prepare for. Anna came over and set a bowl of soup in front of him, her eyes searching his face for some sign of what he was thinking. She sat down beside him, her body weary from the day's work, but her mind as restless as his. "Eli," she said, her voice quiet but firm, "do you believe we are truly ready for this winter?" Eli looked at her, his gaze softening. "I believe we have done what we can," he replied, his voice steady, though it carried the weight of a question he didn't have an answer to. The fire crackled again, and the storm outside only seemed to intensify. The wind whipped against the cabin, but inside, the family stayed close, huddled together in the dim light. Samuel lay down beside his mother, the little ones tucked in close to their father, all of them wrapped in blankets, the warmth from the stove their only defense against the cold. Outside, the snow continued to fall, and Eli couldn't shake the feeling that this was just the beginning. The storm raged through the night, its fury relentless against the walls of the Lapp family's cabin. By morning, the world outside had been swallowed by snow. The ground was hidden beneath a thick, unbroken blanket of white, and the once familiar landscape had been transformed into something alien, silent, and still. The air was colder, heavier, as if the very earth was holding its breath. Inside, the family rose early, their movements slow but purposeful. Eli stoked the fire in the stove, his hands numb from the cold, the wood crackling in the quiet of the morning. Anna moved around the kitchen, preparing a simple breakfast of oatmeal and bread. The children sat at the table, their faces pale from the long hours of the storm, their voices soft as they whispered among themselves. Eli glanced at his wife, her back turned as she worked. Her quiet strength was what anchored him, but today he could see the weariness in her shoulders. The storm had tested their endurance, but it was the silence that was beginning to wear on them. The days had stretched into long, lonely hours. No one came to visit, no one left. It was a kind of isolation they had not known before, one that pressed against their hearts as much as the cold pressed against the walls. "We need more firewood," Eli said finally, his voice breaking the silence. He looked at Anna, who nodded but didn't respond. They both knew what had to be done. The animals still needed care, the barn needed checking, and the supplies needed to be rationed carefully, but there was a heaviness in the air that made each task feel more urgent. "Samuel," Eli called, turning toward his son, who was sitting near the fire with the younger children. "Take your sister and check on the animals. Bring in some more firewood while you're at it." Samuel nodded, rising from his seat. The boys had grown stronger, more capable with each passing year, but even now Eli could see the shadow of uncertainty in his son's eyes. The storm had made the world feel small, and they all knew that it wasn't just the winter that could bring them to their knees. As Samuel bundled up in his coat, Anna stood by the stove, her face drawn but determined. "Eli," she said, her voice low, "what if we can't make it through? What if this storm breaks us?" Eli's heart clenched. He knew the fear that laced her words, the fear that had taken root in his own heart. He didn't know if they would make it through. No one did. But he also knew that there was no choice but to keep moving forward, to keep working, to keep believing. He placed a hand on Anna's shoulder and looked into her eyes, the firelight flickering in them. "We'll make it through, Anna, one day at a time." The day stretched on, and the storm continued its assault on the valley. The wind howled through the cracks in the cabin, and the snow piled up against the door, forcing them to stay inside for most of the day. It was a quiet, tense kind of day. Every creak of the cabin, every shift of the wood, seemed to echo louder than before, as though the house itself was groaning under the weight of the storm. Eli and Anna took turns checking the fire, keeping the children busy with simple games and stories to distract them from the fear that hung in the air. The boys were used to being outside, to the routine of farm work, but today they could do nothing but sit by the fire, watching the storm through the small window that was nearly covered by snow. As the afternoon wore on, the wind began to change. The howling that had been constant started to shift, rising and falling in waves, as though the storm was beginning to lose its strength. Eli could feel a change in the air. He stood up slowly, glancing at Anna. "I'll go check on the barn," he said, his voice firm, though his heart was still heavy. He could see the worry in her eyes, but also the understanding. She didn't protest, knowing that there were things that had to be done, even when the world seemed at its bleakest. With his coat pulled tight and his boots heavy with the snow, Eli stepped outside. The cold hit him like a wave, biting into his face and hands, but he pushed forward. The snow reached his knees now, the landscape a white wasteland where the earth had vanished, and only the outlines of familiar structures remained. The barn was in sight, the roof barely visible beneath the snowdrifts. Eli's heart beat faster as he neared it. The barn was old, sturdy, but he had never faced a storm like this. Would it hold up under the weight? Would the animals be safe? He reached the door and pushed it open, the wind almost stealing the breath from his lungs. Inside, the horses were huddled together, their breath steaming in the cold air, the cows crowded near the hayloft, and the chickens were nestled in their corners. The barn was holding up, but only just. Eli's heart lifted slightly, but he knew this wasn't over. They were barely halfway through the storm. He stayed for a while, checking on the animals, making sure the hay was packed tightly, and that everything was as secure as it could be. The wind picked up again, howling louder than before, and Eli knew it was time to return to the cabin. As he made his way back, the wind seemed to bite harder, the snow flurries stinging his face like tiny needles. When he reached the cabin door, Anna was standing in the doorway, waiting. Her eyes met his, and for a moment, neither of them spoke. The storm still raged outside, but inside they were together, and that was enough for now. "Everything is fine," Eli said, his voice hoarse from the cold. But as they stood there, in the warmth of the firelight, both of them knew that this was just the beginning. The true test was yet to come. The storm had been relentless for days. The snow piled higher and higher, burying the cabin in a quiet white world. Eli and Anna had long since run out of things to do indoors, no more work to be done, no more tasks to fill the hours. They could only wait and pray that the storm would pass, that the land would hold up and the strength of their faith would see them through. Anna had never liked waiting. She had grown accustomed to the rhythm of her hands, to the steady work of the fields, the barn, and the home. But here, now, with the world outside in chaos and her family tucked inside, all she could do was wait and pray. She had tried to keep the children occupied with stories, games, and simple tasks, but they were all too aware of the tension in the air. Even the younger ones were beginning to feel it, the uncertainty that hung over them like a dark cloud. The fire crackled in the hearth, the only comfort in the cold, but it wasn't enough. The walls felt thinner, and the roof seemed to creak under the weight of the snow. Eli moved from room to room, checking the windows, the doors, the fire. Every task felt urgent, every movement deliberate, though none of them brought any true peace. Outside, the wind howled like a living thing, rattling the cabin, knocking against the wooden walls with a force that shook the ground beneath their feet. At the stove, Anna stood with a kettle in her hands, staring into the flames. She knew Eli was doing all he could, but the weight of their situation was starting to press down on her. She could feel it in her bones, the cold that seemed to reach past the fire and into her heart. It wasn't the storm itself that frightened her, it was the feeling that they were powerless against it, that they had prepared, but still, the unknown loomed large and unyielding. Eli came up behind her, his footsteps muffled by the snow. He placed a hand on her shoulder, his warmth offering a small comfort. "We will make it, Anna. We are not alone in this." She turned to him, her face drawn and tired. "I know," she whispered. "But sometimes, Eli, it feels like the storm is more than just weather. It feels like a test." He nodded slowly. "Maybe it is, but we're here, together. That's all that matters." The wind outside began to howl again, and Anna took a deep breath, willing herself to believe his words. But even as she did, there was a part of her that feared the worst fear, that the storm would break them, that the cold would not only steal their warmth, but their hope as well. But just as the night began to fall, with the storm's fury at its peak, Eli heard something outside, a faint sound beneath the roar of the wind. At first, he thought it was his imagination, but then it came again, more distinct this time. A faint knocking, as if someone were calling out through the storm. He rushed to the door, heart pounding. Outside, through the swirling snow, a figure appeared, tall, hunched against the wind, but unmistakable. Samuel. Eli opened the door with urgency, the cold biting him immediately as he stepped outside to greet his son. Samuel was covered in snow, his face pale and drawn, but his eyes bright with purpose. He had made it back. Against the odds, he had returned, dragging a sled behind him, piled high with firewood. "Father," Samuel said, his breath fogging in the cold. "I didn't think I could make it, but I kept hearing you in my head telling me not to give up. So I kept going, one step at a time." Eli didn't speak. Instead, he pulled Samuel into a tight embrace, both of them grateful for the moment of connection. Samuel had done the impossible, braving the full force of the storm to return with what they so desperately needed. And in doing so, he had brought with him something that went beyond firewood. He had brought hope. Inside, Anna was already at the door, her hands shaking with the effort to steady herself. "Samuel!" she exclaimed, relief and love flooding her voice as she wrapped her arms around him. "You're home." "I didn't give up, Mama," Samuel said, his voice tired but determined. "I promised I wouldn't." Eli stood back, looking at his son, seeing not just the boy who had left a few hours before, but the man who had just proved to himself and to all of them that even in the darkest of moments, faith and perseverance would carry them through. "Let's get you warm," Anna said, taking Samuel by the arm. "You're nearly frozen." They settled him by the fire, his frozen body melting slowly under the warmth of the stove. As he sat there, with his mother, wrapping him in blankets, Eli moved to the door to look out into the storm once more. It was still raging, but in that moment, something shifted inside him. The storm, the cold, the darkness, they were all part of something greater, something he couldn't control. But what he could control, what he had, was his family, his faith. He closed the door softly, stepping back to join his family. As he did, he felt the weight of the storm lift slightly. It was still there, still howling outside, but within the walls of their home, warmth had returned, not just from the fire, but from the unity they had shared. The storm would continue. It would test them again and again, but as long as they had each other, they would endure. By the third day of the storm, the Lapp family had settled into a quiet, tense rhythm. The storm had not let up. The wind howled like a living thing, and the snow continued to pile up around the cabin, covering the land as far as the eye could see. Each day, the family ventured outside only for the essentials, checking the barn, bringing in firewood, ensuring the animals were safe. But with each passing hour, the world outside grew more desolate. The storm felt as if it was closing in on them, pushing them to their limits. Anna moved through the cabin, her steps slow, her face pale. The children had grown quieter, the weight of the storm pressing on them as well. They knew their parents were trying to keep them calm, to keep their spirits up, but it was becoming harder. The cold had settled deep into their bones, and the warmth from the stove no longer seemed to reach the corners of the cabin. The flickering firelight couldn't chase away the uncertainty that clung to the air. Eli stood by the window, staring out at the endless white. His heart was heavy, his thoughts turning over the same questions. Was it enough? Had they prepared well enough? Would the storm break them, or would they make it through? The weight of responsibility felt heavier than it had in years. "Pa," Samuel's voice broke through his thoughts. "We should check the roof. The snow is piling up. It might collapse if we don't do something." Eli nodded, but the thought of climbing up onto the roof in this storm made his stomach turn. The wind was brutal, the snow falling in sheets. But Samuel's words hung in the air like a warning. They couldn't wait. They had to act. "Get your coat," Eli said, his voice steady despite the doubt creeping into his heart. "We'll go together." The two of them made their way to the door, the cold slamming into them the moment it opened. The snow had accumulated in massive drifts, and as they stepped out into the storm, it felt as if the very earth was trying to swallow them whole. Eli squinted into the wind, guiding Samuel toward the roof ladder, which was barely visible beneath the snow. The roof was heavy with snow, and Eli could feel his body protesting as he climbed. Once on top, the full force of the storm hit them. The wind howled like a beast, and the snow stung their faces, freezing their skin in an instant. Eli could barely see his own hands in the blinding white. He and Samuel worked together, shoveling the snow from the roof, but even with both of them working, it felt as if the storm was winning. The weight of the snow was immense, pressing down on them, on the cabin, on everything. It felt like a breaking point. But then, just as they thought they couldn't take another step, they cleared the last of the snow from the roof. The sky, though still heavy with clouds, seemed to give them a brief respite, a moment of calm amidst the chaos. Eli stood on the roof, breathless, his heart pounding. He looked at Samuel, his son, standing beside him in the storm. They had done it, together, and for that moment It was enough. "We'll make it through, son," Eli said quietly, his voice lost in the wind. "One step at a time." As the days passed, the storm showed no signs of letting up, but, in the quiet moments between the work, the storm had begun to lose its power over them. The rhythm of survival had settled in a daily task, a steady focus, a quiet determination. Though the world outside was still locked in the grasp of winter's fury, inside the cabin, the family had found a kind of peace in the midst of the chaos. Eli and Samuel worked together to keep the roof clear, and the barn was checked each day for snow buildup. The children had grown accustomed to the cold, their games quieter now, their voices softer as they sat near the fire. Anna, though exhausted, continued to care for the home, her hands steady and sure, and Eli could see the strength in her eyes, even when she didn't speak it aloud. The moments of silence were the hardest. It was during these times that the weight of the storm truly felt oppressive. The uncertainty, the fear, these things crept in when there was nothing to do but wait. But somehow, in those moments, Eli found solace in the pairing by war, the presence of his family. They had each other, and no matter how hard the storm raged, that was the one thing that would not be taken from them. On the 6th day of the storm, as the winds began to soften, Eli stepped outside to check on the animals once again. The snow had stopped falling, but the wind still blew, a harsh reminder that winter was far from over. But as he opened the barn door, a lightness he hadn't felt in days flooded his chest. The animals were safe, the barn was intact, the roof had held. For the first time in what felt like an eternity, Eli breathed deeply, filling his lungs with the cold air. The worst had passed. The storm had not broken them. He stood there for a long moment, looking out at the land, blanketed in snow, the trees bare and still. But beneath the white, beneath the cold, the earth was still alive, still waiting for spring, and so were they. Eli made his way back to the cabin, his steps lighter now, his heart lifted by the knowledge that they had made it through. He could see Anna through the window, her back to him as she worked in the kitchen, the children playing quietly by the fire. Inside, the warmth of the hearth and the sound of their voices were a soft promise that no matter what lay ahead, they would face it together. When Eli stepped inside, Anna turned to him, her face lighting up with relief. "The storm?" she asked, her voice hesitant. "It's breaking," Eli replied, his voice filled with a quiet joy. "We made it." And as he stepped further into the warmth of their home, surrounded by his family, Eli knew that while the storm had tested them, it had also revealed something deeper, their strength, their faith, and their love for each other. The storm would pass, and they would remain. The morning after the storm broke, the valley was unrecognizable. Snow, once so pure and pristine, now lay in jagged heaps, swept into drifts that nearly reached the height of the cabin's porch. The sun was beginning to peek through the overcast sky, and though it was still early in the day, there was a sense of quiet anticipation in the air, as if the land itself was taking a deep breath after the chaos. Eli stood on the porch, his hands resting on the railing as he gazed out over the snow-covered fields. The world was still, save for the occasional gust of wind that kicked up small flurries, but it was no longer the wild, uncontrolled storm they had endured for days. The quiet now felt like a blessing, a promise that the worst was over. Inside, Anna was busy preparing breakfast, but her movements were slower than usual, her tired eyes betraying the exhaustion that had accumulated over the past week. She had worked tirelessly alongside Eli, ensuring the children were cared for and the home stayed warm, but the storm had drained her, just as it had drained them all. Yet, despite her weariness, there was a quiet peace about her this morning. The storm had not broken them. They had made it through together. "Anna," Eli called softly, not wanting to disturb the fragile silence of the morning. "The storm is over. The animals are fine. I think we can start cleaning up around here." Anna turned to him, her eyes softening with relief. "I'm so glad," she whispered. But then she sighed deeply. "But there's still so much to do. The land is buried under all that snow. We'll have to dig our way out." Eli nodded, understanding the magnitude of the task ahead. "We'll take it slow, one step at a time." Anna smiled faintly and nodded, grateful for his steady presence. Together, they worked through the morning. The children helped when they could, though their small hands were not yet strong enough to move the heavy snow. But they tried, mimicking their parents, taking their part in the family's work. Samuel, now full of youthful energy, ran outside to help Eli clear the path to the barn, his boots sinking into the snow with each step. By midday, the cabin felt warmer, both from the fire and from the knowledge that the worst of the storm had passed. The family gathered at the table for their meal, their faces drawn but their spirits lifted. The children chatted softly among themselves, as if the storm had never happened. And for a moment the past few days seemed like a distant memory, a challenge they had overcome together. After breakfast, Eli and Samuel donned their coats and made their way outside to begin clearing the snow. With each shovelful, they uncovered more of the familiar land they knew so well. The barn stood tall against the snowdrifts, its roof intact. The fields were untouched by human hands, save for their tracks leading to and from the house. The landscape had changed, but it was still home. As they worked, Eli looked at his son, his heart swelling with pride. Samuel had proven himself during the storm. He had shown courage, determination, and strength, just as Eli had hoped. And Eli knew that this winter, this test of their faith, had made them all stronger. "We'll finish this together, Samuel," Eli said, his voice filled with quiet resolve. "One step at a time." As the days passed, the valley slowly returned to life. The snow began to melt, revealing patches of the earth that had been hidden beneath the storm's weight. The sound of birds returning to the trees filled the air, and though the wind still carried a chill, there was a promise of spring in the breeze. Eli and Anna worked together, side by side, restoring their home and farm. There was no time to waste. The garden needed tending, the animals needed care, and the barn needed to be cleared of the remnants of the storm. But each day, the tasks grew easier. The storm, though devastating, had brought them closer. It had reminded them of the importance of family, of faith, and of the land they had worked so hard to cultivate. One evening, as Eli sat outside on the porch, the children playing quietly in the yard, he felt a deep sense of contentment wash over him. The worst was behind them. The storm had tested them, but it had also revealed something stronger, a bond that couldn't be broken, no matter how fierce the wind or how deep the snow. They had survived, not just through their own strength, but through their love and their faith. Anna came out to join him, her face warm in the glow of the setting sun. She sat beside him, her hand resting lightly on his arm. "We've come through, haven't we?" she said softly, her voice full of quiet wonder. Eli nodded, his eyes tracing the familiar horizon. "Yes, we have." As the sun dipped below the horizon, casting a golden glow across the valley, Eli knew that this was not just the end of the storm, it was the beginning of something new. The land had been tested, the family had been tested, and they had come through stronger, more united than ever. The challenges they faced would always be a part of their story, but so too would be the quiet moments of peace, the warmth of their home, and the love they shared. And as Eli looked at his family, at Anna, Samuel, and the younger children, who were running and laughing in the fading light, he knew that whatever the future held, they would face it together, with faith, with love, and with the strength that only a family bound by love and faith could possess.